All right, let's take you back to New York now, where Reserve Bank Govenor Lesetja Kganyago is in conversation with JSE CEO Leila Fourie. Let's listen in.
And preempting the most recent monetary policy cycle, which saw decade-long highs in inflation and interest rates. We are meeting at a very important time. In the next 8 days, back home in South Africa, our finance minister will present his medium-term policy budget speech. And at the same time, we will be facing one of the most important elections of the year, possibly the decade, with far-reaching implications. There was a time when the South African financial system presented what would have been a very concerning and risk-centric position, lots of surprises. And since the government of national unity, we've seen a lot more positive investor sentiment. We've seen a lot more stability and a very big positive turnaround over the past sort of 3 to 4 months in delivery. And all of these things, of course, culminate in a very important agenda and concern for central banks, and particularly for our Governor Lesetja Kganyago. And so if we now move into the concept of growth, Governor, we all know that the IMF has recently upgraded South Africa's GDP growth outlook to align, in fact, with the SAB at 1.1% for the year. From 0.9%. And we have on a panel later today both Transnet and Eskom. And the first question that we'd like to cover off, Governor, is your view on the growth outlook and how the interplay between the progress that has been made in the electricity provision and therefore the impact on growth, and how that contrasts with the work that is still underway, much of which has started, but still lots of work to be done. And Michelle will talk to that in her panel around Transnet. So how are those affecting the way you think about growth?
Thank you very much, Leila. Good to be on this panel. I think that we might be mixing two distinct but both important aspects to growth. So the stuff that you had talked on earlier on, including the revisions by the IMF, deal very much with cyclical growth. And that is clearly on the upswing. The stuff that you started to refer to with respect to electricity and logistics are the structural components to growth, which are actually even more important. So last year in January, the SAB estimated that the electricity constraint would deduct a full 2 percentage points from growth, which basically means we would have grown by closer to 3% if we didn't have the electricity constraint. As the situation on the electricity front improved, we also revised that. And for the current year, we expect that the electricity constraint would have deducted 0.3% from growth. It's a significant revision. And again, it's the law of big numbers because before the load shedding was ended, you had that massive impact on growth, which was negative. And as the situation started to improve, then you clawed back on what was being deducted from growth, and that is important. But sorting out the electricity situation also became important for sentiment. If you remember that changing sentiment from being negative to being positive, you do not spend money on it. It's basically the cheapest form of stimulus. That is what you would get. Just give you an idea about sentiment. And so Minister Ramokgopa and Eskom, they make the announcement that there will be no load shedding this week. There will be no load shedding for the month. And then the time was going on. Just give you an idea of how negative the sentiment was. So the sentiment in South Africa, just before the elections was, this is all a big conspiracy. And a day after the elections, load shedding is going to return. That is how negative the environment was. 200 days and counting, we do not have load shedding. Mr. Marokane says to me that he has also hit the lowest level of unplanned outages. That changes sentiment, and it's that has actually led to the revision of growth, not just by the IMF. You will see the others doing the revisions, and that's positive. But you also have a situation now where the commodity cycle is turning, and so we can take gold and platinum and put it in aeroplanes and fly it all over. We can't do that with iron ore and coal and manganese. You actually need to sort out the logistics system. And once again, there is progress. Unfortunately, the manner in which we measure progress is measuring it in the situation is less negative rather than it's positive. And why am I saying that? Is because what we have seen is a reduction of freight, road freight, and you are starting to see an increase in rail freight. That means that people are having more confidence that the rail is beginning to work, and it is a cheaper way of moving goods than coming through roads. There are other structural aspects to growth. There is Mr. Vulindlela somewhere in the room, Deputy Minister Masonto, and is dealing with those constraints to growth. And the work that was done by the National Treasury showed that if these constraints to growth that Vulindlela had identified, if these constraints are removed, you will see growth taking off. And that becomes the most important part of the growth narrative, because what you need is to increase the potential growth rate of the economy. At the moment, we estimate potential growth rate to be 1.3%. If growth materializes, it's 1.1, you are quickly having a closure of the output gap, and for all intents and purposes, the output gap is non-existent. And so you actually need to lift the potential growth rate of the economy, and that means dealing with all of those structural issues that had been identified in Operation Vulindlela that has got to be dealt with. So that is the growth story.
Excellent, and we'll hear a little bit more about that on the infrastructure and electricity discussions from...
All right, of course, Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago in conversation there with the JSE CEO Leila Fourie at the 11th SA Tomorrow conference underway in New York currently. Earlier, we heard, of course, from President Cyril Ramaphosa, who said South Africa is open for business. Many topics under discussion, including the country's growth rate, investor confidence, policy and fiscal management. We'll continue to give you an update on what else has been said in that conference.